such a common phenomenon that demographers call it the demographic transition. Like, it's the thing that happens as a population gets more money and modernizes and industrializes and educates and all that. Phase one, basically everybody's gone through, which is where the death rates fall. Phase one of the demographic transition is where a lot of these countries in the red are stuck. The death rates have gone down because of more stuff for everyone. And the population goes into exponential growth. Though it is worth noting, you guys did a nice job yesterday of coming up with reasons why people in poor countries might have more babies. You missed one that has to do with death rate. Some of those countries in Africa, what do you know, Grant? Some of those countries in Africa and the Middle East have higher death rates due to what?
Violence.
Due to violence, due to the fact that maybe partly the lack of economic stability has led to a lack of social stability, and there's civil war, or in some cases even like genocide and stuff like that. And so imagine you're a person growing up there and you have this urge to have children, but you don't know that they will all survive. That can drive people to have more children, just to ensure that their line carries on and it doesn't end with them. So that's a very real thing that we didn't mention yesterday. But so phase one, death rates go down. Birth rates stay high. Population goes into that J curve, right? But phase two is the interesting one, where as populations become more wealthy, we see them lowering their birth rates somehow. Deciding to have less children. The Green Revolution did a good job of raising the Earth's carrying capacity for people, but as we approach it again, right, as we get above that 8 billion people mark, one of the things that's interesting is the idea is, can we get more people in more countries to go through this transition? Can we be different than the rabbits, right? That aren't able to look up and say, oh, here comes the carrying capacity, maybe we should have less. Are we smarter than the rabbits? Remains to be seen. But that is something on ecologists and lots of people's minds, is how do we deal with overpopulation? So that's the first thing I want in your brains as we start, because today's the day we start with the long list of environmental problems facing us. In the back of your minds, I want this, because what I don't want is to go through this list of terrible environmental problems and have you starting to think humans are evil somehow. I mean, maybe you think that, maybe you don't. But what I want solid in your brains is, number one, there's an awful lot of us. And whether we're evil or not, there being more and more and more and more of us is bound to put pressure on ecosystems, right? Whether we mean to or not. I want to show you a graph just to kind of make this a numbers thing in terms of the demographic transition. The basic idea being that birth rates and death rates both start out high, back through to 200,000 years ago, origins of humans. They're both high. And so the population curve, which is the black one here, stays steady. It's when death rates fall, but birth rates stay high, that we see that exponential phase kick in. But then it's that second part where the birth rates come down in those wealthy countries. That's when, and they come down to match the death rates, that's when we level off. Okay, so that's the idea. Okay. Resources. There is and this is the second thing I want in the back of your brain. There's only two. Overpopulation is one. And two is something called the tragedy of the commons, which is the ecological, it's almost like a fable, but it's real. A lesson that someone kind of drew out in the 1800s based on his experiences. So I'm going to show you a short video about that. They can explain it maybe a little better than I can.
Were shaped in those which had an owner. Why? Simply because the short-term self-interest of the people who were using those pastures made them consume too many resources, and in the long run, everyone suffered. George asked himself, should I buy another animal? And decided that yes, you'd make more money that way. He knew he was overloading the pasture, but didn't care. He wanted the extra money. The problem is that everyone did the same thing. In the end, the pasture was brutally overloaded, and therefore became unusable. Some people made short-term profits, but in the long run, everyone lost. As far as the pastures which had an owner were concerned, this didn't happen because it's in the best interest of the owners to exploit their property sustainably. Today, similar situations occur frequently. For example, with fishing grounds such as the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, which used to be home to a huge population. About 50 years ago, however, technology enabled people to catch a lot more fish than before. The fish population, and thereby the fishing industry, collapsed by the 90s. They might never recover. The same way, humans are doing everything from polluting their oceans and atmosphere to generating traffic jams during rush hour. There we have it, the tragedy of the commons.
Okay, so basically, it's a story about farmland that they called the commons. A lot of towns that there were a lot of farmers there with grazing animals, they would make it public land if they had some land to spare and say, hey, everybody can graze their animals on this land. And what they found was every time they did that, people would get more animals so they could make more money, and the field would get overgrazed and basically turn into a desert. And so the guy that wrote about that phenomenon basically said, this is something that's going to happen every time humans have access to a resource that's valuable, but it's totally unregulated. Okay, so it's called the tragedy of the commons, and the basic idea is that when a resource is available for everyone, but nobody regulates it, we will use it up until it's gone. Come on, people can use things sustainably even when they're not monitored, when there's not laws to make it happen. People aren't that bad. And I say it's not a question of being bad. It's a question of human nature, because I saw Gavin last Halloween. You know that one house that leaves the big bucket of candy out with the sign that says, only take 2 pieces of candy? You know that house? Uh-huh. And I can't even blame Gavin, honestly, because I saw the kids in front of him. And the first kid was a good kid. He took his 2 pieces, and the second kid took his 2 pieces, mainly, I think, because their parents were watching. And then the third kid took a double handful out of the bucket. And his thing, made sure nobody was looking, took off. Fourth kid, Gavin's the 6th kid. Fourth kid's like, and now the bucket's like halfway empty. Fifth kid just takes a handful. Gavin's like, this is almost gone. Like, I'm gonna get mine. Like, what if all the houses are like this? I need to take care of right now. I need candy. And he just takes the thing and dumps it into his pillowcase. You see what I'm saying, right? Like, understand that that's candy and kids. Now imagine that the bucket's full of $20 bills, and we're talking about grown adults. And what I'm saying is you can basically consider the ocean full of fish to be a big bucket of money, right? Those fish are worth a lot. Like a tuna can go for $10,000. No joke. And you can just catch them if you have the stuff. Why wouldn't you take more? I mean, there's regulations, but I mean, go out far enough, who's going to catch you? It's a thing that humans tend to do. And some would say this is based on our evolutionary history of, 200,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. We're hunter-gatherers. We kill a deer. Do we have a way to preserve that deer for later? Nope. And so we are wired to eat ourselves almost sick, eat so much of that deer that we store a lot of energy as fat and save it for later. But if you're wired to use up stuff as soon as you get it, then that applies to other areas of your life too. So lots of people, I was totally making that up, by the way. I did not see Gavin last Halloween. I just had to pick somebody, and Gavin's fun to mess with. Every once in a while, I do get a kid who's like, Mr. Sandro, you were not there.
You were in coaches.
What?
Said you were in coaches.
Yeah, don't. Lots of people on the planet, people tend to be wired a certain way to get ours before everybody else does, right? That is kind of something to think of as maybe a root cause behind a lot of these things. It's not that we're evil, it's that we are numerous and wired a certain way. Good, now the thing you could do in your sleep, don't fall asleep, but, right, there are two types of resources. No, they're all natural. Word we use usually is renewable. Yeah, renewable resources and non-renewable resources. Non-renewable resources include such resources as help me out. Coal, oil, natural gas, fossil fuels, absolutely. And those take truly millions and millions of years to form. Lots and lots of dead things decomposed and deposited in the carbon cycle, pressurized in certain ways, so that they become very energy rich and burnable and usable. And we basically built our whole society around exploiting those, right? Pretty much most of our industrial technology is based on using fossil fuels to power stuff. Changing, but changing slowly. Well, when those things run out, they're gone. There's really no question about that. The question comes with the supposedly renewable resources. Now, there's some that you asked about that absolutely are about as renewable as they come, right? Sunlight, it's not going away. Geothermal energy is a pretty reliable energy source that isn't going to go away. Wind power, sure, those are good ones. But the other ones that we think of as renewable resources, like timber, like fresh water, and like clean air, we're doing a pretty good job of proving that wrong. I mean, the kind of wood that's good for building is not fast-growing wood. The kind of wood that's good for building is hardwood, and those trees take like hundreds of years to get big. At least, 50 or so years to get decent size at hardwood. And softwood, you can build with it, but it's the warmth, not as good. We've cleared basically 80% of the world's old growth hardwood forests. And so timber turns out to not be completely renewable. Fresh water, we talked about groundwater. And that's going to be our first environmental problem we talk about, because most ecologists think it's the first major ecological issue we run into that really threatens our population. I thought there was another thing there. No, maybe not. So yeah, here we go. Let's talk about environmental problem number one. Now, this is the beginning, like I said, of a long list of kind of bummers. right? Kind of downers. And so I will do my best. This dark spot here we're about to talk about, I'll hit you with a bright spot right afterwards. But yeah, freshwater depletion is a big deal because that groundwater that we rely on so much in this country, in the West especially, because the West is pretty dry. It's pretty dry out there. And yet, there's so many people that live there and so many people that farm and ranch there. Because it's a bunch of wide open space and we got to feed people. A lot of farming goes on out there, totally dependent on groundwater because there's not enough rain for their crops to grow and for their cattle and other livestock to get enough water. And so they pull that water from underwater aquifer. An aquifer is an underground body of water. We used the slushy analogy, right? About how pulling groundwater too fast, too much, creates that cone of dry ground, just like when you drink a slushy too fast. And you get over the brain freeze and you notice there's this big cone of dry ice in your cup. That's what happens to the ground, except that the syrup water doesn't seep back in very fast at all. Like they move like inches per year, these bodies of groundwater. So kind of like old growth forests, aquifers, when they're depleted, take hundreds of years to regenerate. Double whammy for that is deforestation. We'll talk about that as a separate issue, but it's also very much a part of this one because when you clear forests, you take away the land's ability to hold that water and to hold the soil together. And so that good soil kind of slides off the top and erodes away. You lose the contours of the land and you basically get desert conditions eventually. You break the water cycle in that area. And that water sloughs off somewhere else. That water eventually ends up in the ocean. And once it's in the ocean, you're kind of starting to load your fresh water into salt water, and it's not fresh water. We're going to watch a whole video about that issue separately because it's too much for me to kind of explain the ins and outs of, but it's big. The combination of overusing fresh water and taking away the land's ability to hold it by clearing vegetation turns out to be a big deal.
So the Mississippi goes into the ocean, right?
Yeah.
Is all the water in the Mississippi fresh water?
Except for at the very end, you get this transitional area. They call it brackish water. It's a really cool ecosystem. Mangrove trees live there with their roots sticking out, and they actually manage to deal with that salt water in interesting ways. It's a totally cool ecosystem. Yeah, good question.
Well, how does that fresh water like come back into the river or into the other rivers too? Is it just that it rains everywhere?
Well, it's that there's this that the head of the Mississippi, way up, I don't even know where, is where it starts, right? And that comes from, yes, rainwater, but also, you know, the groundwater and the watershed there. And so, but yeah, no, it's dumping into the ocean. It's not coming back from the ocean. But I guess you could say the rain that comes from the evaporation comes back. I promise the video will tell you more about that. I'm not as good at explaining stuff like that. Yes, you should take shorter showers. Yes, you should turn the water off when you're brushing your teeth. But really, you are not the major freshwater user in this country or in most countries. Mainly it's agriculture. To feed as many people as we have takes an awful lot of water. 75% of the fresh water used in this country is used for agriculture. Not saying you shouldn't try to personally conserve water, just saying you're 1/4 of the problem, you know, maybe less than that, because I think industrial processes use a lot as well. Solutions, I mean, you ever seen a big industrial farm irrigation setup? Okay, have you ever been in an airplane and looked down and wondered why you saw perfect circles in the farmland? You ever seen those? I did. I remember asking my parents, and they were like, I don't know. Here's why. Those things. I forget what it's called, but it's the main way farmers irrigate their fields. What it is basically a big, huge set of pipes on wheels anchored to a center point in the field, and then the water going through it forces the thing to roll very slowly around that center hub, creating the edges of the field, right? So it's a perfectly round field because the irrigator is moving in circles all day. That's how high the water's coming from. On a hot day in full sun, where is most of that water going? Straight back up into the atmosphere. It's evaporating, right? A much more efficient way to irrigate fields is drip irrigation, where you run pipes down at ground level and the water bleeds out slowly under the crop cover so that there's minimal sunlight hitting it. It's slow enough that it's not flooding the field, but fast enough that the roots are sucking it up. Much more efficient way to do it, uses much less water. But of course, it costs money to switch from that to drip irrigation. And so it's hard to get farmers who are on narrow margins of profit to do that. That's the problem with a lot of these solutions. Wetlands are another piece of this. Wetlands are really, really effective groundwater rechargers. They take water in and purify it and send it into the groundwater system. And unfortunately, this is like the second fastest disappearing ecosystem on Earth behind rainforests. So protecting those wetlands is something that would certainly help protect our groundwater. Unfortunately, wetlands are commonly known as swamps. People don't see much value in them typically when they want to build, settlements, right? You can't build on a swamp. You got to drain the swamp and basically destroy it. So there's your big environmental problem for the day. Here's the bright spot. It's not going to sound like a bright spot, but I got a good story. You know about the ozone holes? You know about the ozone layer? What is it? What does the ozone layer do for us? What service does it provide? Chris? Which part of the sunlight? Which kind? So the sun's radiation is very broad spectrum. You've got the visible light spectrum, right? And then you've got infrared radiation, which is heat. What do we call the much shorter wavelength? Infrared is longer wavelength than visible light. What do we call shorter wavelength?
Ultraviolet.
Ultraviolet, right? Infrared, which means below red, and ultraviolet, which means above violet. Well, UV rays are so short-wave that they can penetrate cell membranes and knock apart DNA. They're bad for you in high doses, right? Low doses, they give you a nice tan. High doses, skin cancer. So the ozone layer protects us from that. And in the 80s, we realized, oh crap, there's these holes in the ozone layer opening at the north and south pole, basically, over the Arctic and the Antarctic. Remember bears and no bears. And we traced it basically to this one chemical that we were using as propellant in spray cans and in other things as well, called chlorofluorocarbons. And so in one of the better success stories of regulating pollutants, CFCs were completely banned. By the way, these holes in the ozone are interesting because they open in the summer and then they close in the winter. Because of the way air circulates, you get these, it's called a polar vortex, basically. That's not just something that causes cold weather here. It's what happens over the poles in certain times of the year, where in the winter, it all swirls together and a lot of the ozone is there. And the CFCs will start knocking apart the molecules. And then when they spread back out in the summer, that's when, oh, there's less ozone, so there's a hole. So here's what I get to tell a story, because this is kind of a near and dear thing for me. I got to go to Antarctica I left in 2004. I left in like late December 2004, and I spent 2 months on a research station studying a bug. I'll tell you more about that later. But the point of this story is my roommate in Antarctica was a dude named Tad. He was kind of a prototypical Arizona, I don't know, not a stoner exactly, but one of those real laid back dudes. Blonde, blue eyed, like, hey man, like, He drank a lot. There was like a bar on station. Like you had to bring your own stuff, but it was like a bar and people go there. And he kept trying to get me to go to the midnight club. Dude, you gotta come to the midnight club. I was like, what is this? And when I found out it was just he and his research partner Wally, big hulking dude, who barely fit in the shower in our communal space. And they would just when it struck midnight, they would do a shot of liquor. It's kind of not what I was into, but yeah. So Tad was a botanist, and so was Wally. They were botanists at Arizona State University, and they came down to study the effects of ultraviolet light on plants. And so they planted a plot of plants out back of the station, and every day they would take data because the ozone hole was open. Boy, was it open. There's like a trash can sized thing of sunscreen by the door. And when my team and I would go out in these Zodiac boats to the different islands, we would like slather up with sunscreen because you could get burned fast, right? So he's doing research on how the UV light affects his plants, right? Except that one day I get back from going out collecting bugs, and Tad is in our room already drunk. I mean, it's like 5 maybe, and he's like, "It's over, it's done." He's not crying, but he's clearly upset. And I'm like, "What? Calm down, man. Like, what's going on?" He's like, "The hole closed. It's closed. It's done. I can't get any more data. This is like a wasted trip. It sucks." For like the first year since we discovered the ozone holes, the ozone hole had closed significantly early in the summer. And so he was done. And it costs like $1 million to do a research trip down to Antarctica. You get funding from like the NIH or somewhere, and then you do your trip and you make sure you plan it out perfectly so you get all the data you need before you have to leave. He was done. And he had like, 3 weeks left of just doing nothing. Bad news for him and Wally. Really good news for the planet. Basically, since then, and that was 2005, it looks like the ozone holes are healing. Now, it is 2020, so of course, this year it's bigger than it's been in a while. I just read something about it this morning. I was like, oh my God, I'm teaching that today. Like, ozone hole, biggest it's been since 2010 or something. But scientists do estimate that by like 2060, the damage done by CFCs will be pretty much healed. So there's your good news for the day. Yeah.
You ever keep tabs on that dude?
Man, he was so cool. Like just an odd person. Like he had a pet rock. Like it was just a rock that had like, the kind of granite that has a stripe, like a white stripe through it. He had one of those by his bed, and he called him Mr. Stripey. And like one time he just looked at me like I think we were eating dinner or something. He goes, "Do you miss him, Luke?" "Miss who?" He goes, "Mr. Stripey." No, I like that. No, he did not. And I'll tell you why, because basically you could get sent home for that. Yeah, I don't know what he was doing outside of that, but I know there wasn't anything like that in Antarctica. Promise. I end up